Thank you, Shin. Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm very honored to be moderating this session, uh, practically the substance of our event today. First of all, I'm very, very happy to be here today and leading one of the first, I guess, joint knowledge events with OECD. We're very, very pleased to have organized this for you today. And so what we will have for this session, we will hear results of analytical pieces from OECD, earlier introduced already, and also from the World Bank, some analytical work on Africa, particularly on jobs and the role of cities in African development. We will start with a presentation from OECD, and this will be delivered by Dr. Arthur Minsat, the head of the Middle East unit of the OECD Development Center. He is senior economist, and he holds a PhD in economics from the London School of Economics. He is responsible for this particular series of reports, and he has been working on several other analytical work on Africa. He has worked before in UNDP and contributed to the flagship human development reports. He worked for the UN as well in Cote d'Ivoire, and I believe also in the World Bank in the beginning. Before that, he was in the private sector and taught economics and international relations at the London School of Economics. So, Dr. Minsat, please.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies. It's such an honor to be here, having started at the World Bank, being back again a few decades after that. It's such an honor. And I'm carrying out delivering this presentation on behalf of the African Union Commission, because this report is the flagship report of the African Union Commission. My co-presenter, Dr. Patrick Olomo, so there is a technical issue, so I will deliver this presentation on behalf of both institutions. But he conveys his regards, and he's online, but there is an issue with the connection. So apologies for that. And again, it's on behalf of both our organizations. So this flagship is the flagship report of the African Union for its member states in collaboration with the OECD Development Center. We have 12 African members, soon to be 12 African member states in our board. And we benefit from the expertise of the African Union and its agencies, including AUDA, NEPAD, African academics, co-draft regional chapters, 5 regional chapters of this report for West, North, East, Central, and Southern Africa. And we also benefit from the OECD's expertise across the board, and we benefit from the financial and technical support of the European Union, Germany, Portugal, and Italy as part of this flagship report that started in 2018 with the aim to develop a joint narrative on development perspectives for Africa to achieve the African Union's Agenda 2063, particularly the Pillar 2 on growth, which is why the first theme was on growth, jobs, and inequality. And we saw there that despite having the second highest rate of economic growth in the world, today at 4% for the African continent, just behind developing Asia, the number of jobs that was created by this growth was not high enough. And we see similar trends for urban development, with high rates of urban development not conducive to enhancement in productivity and creating jobs in a context of relatively high inequality depending on the countries. So therefore, we then narrowed down the narrative to focus on industrialization, on Africa's productive transformation in 2019 in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, digital transformation with mobile money banking, with artificial intelligence and the fourth industrial revolution on the way on the African continent. What are the opportunities there also for regional value chains in the context of the African continental free trade area and its implementation, investment and skills this year in 2024, and next year will be on productive infrastructure, which is the theme of the new report that we are preparing at the moment. So this report has 3 main messages. in the 7 chapters. So I will really deliver a condensed analysis of the contents of the report, but for more details, I invite you to download through the QR code the entire report, 250 pages of wisdom that you can see on the report. So first is the link between skills development and productivity. So the report highlights that skills development can increase the productivity of Africa's talent. There's a lot of talent on the continent, a lot of skills, a lot of improvement in terms of education, also through vocational training to adapt it to the demand for skills in the job market. However, there is a big mismatch between the skills that are being developed through education institutions and the skills that are demanded on the job market. So these opportunities are not sufficiently reaped, and whereas we could, countries, and the 54 African countries could devise country-specific strategies to develop a virtuous cycle of better skills for better jobs. But this goes hand in hand together. If we have only education institutions, reform of the education system, and not the skills demand in the job market being met, then this virtuous circle will not be developed. So it's really important to work hand in hand, public, private sector actors, education actors together to create these jobs, and having this demand between this skills supply and skills demand being met. And finally, we need to strike the right balance to have inclusive policies for higher productivity and employment potential. So first of all, a quick overview of Japan's trade relations and investment with the African continent. As you can see here, so the region with whom Japan exports the most is West Africa, and with important exports, particularly in the transport services. And what we can see also with the data is that while investment is very important, there is also some room for improvement to have Japan becoming one of the top greenfield investors into the African continent, as you can see from the graph on the left-hand side. So this is a first overview. And second, you can see here the type of products that are being traded between Japan and the African continent. So first in transport equipment, industrial supplies, and also parts and accessories as some of the main traded exports with the African continent. Now let me move to the first point on the skills development, which has a huge potential to boost Africa's continent by 154 trillion US dollars. Which is absolutely huge. So there's huge benefits that could be drawn from continuing to invest in education on the continent. First, with the returns to education are the highest in Africa compared to other world regions, with each additional year of education that could bring 8 to 11% of higher earnings for African learners. And in a macroeconomic modeling that we used, we saw that the GDP, Africa's GDP, could be increased by almost 23 times if we were to have all pupils in schools reaching universal learning. So in other words, the PISA level of learning, then the GDP could be multiplied by 23. This is really important because while there's been a lot of progress being made, the average number of years of schoolings has increased from 4.6 years to almost 7 years in 2020. Yet when we take into account what are the actual learnings that pupils, students have learned at school, so when we look at the learning adjusted mean years of schooling, in other words, what is the quality of the education systems that are provided on the African continent, is then lower So falling from 6.7 years of schooling on average to 5.1 years when accounting for learning outcomes. So this is, of course, to take with the pinch of salt, because as we will see, there are differences, huge differences between countries and regions. But when looking at the quality of the education is particularly important. At the OECD, we use, of course, the PISA model, but there are different types. Also, the UNESCO has its own ways of assessing the quality of education outcomes that can also be used in the African continent. And that is really important to better understand what is the quality of the human resources and compare them also with other developing regions. So how to do that? The first element that we looked at is financing, of course, is also being at the World Bank, we have to talk about financing education. And we looked at the UNESCO's benchmarks. The UNESCO has typically two types of benchmarks. One reaching the 15% of government expenditure on education. As you can see, several countries reached that benchmark. 6 reach only that benchmark, but not the other benchmark, which is the public expenditure of education to be above 4%. So on average, the African government spent around for 3.7% of the GDP, almost 15% of the budget on education, which is good, and 16. But we can highlight, as you can see in the lower left quadrant, that 16 out of these countries with data did not meet either of these benchmarks. So there's some room for improvement here. But also, it's not only about financing more. The question is also about the quality of the finance. In other words, we see that they are, with the IMF, we saw that there is a gap, an annual gap in the quality of spending of about 40 million per year, US dollars. And that can be improved by focusing on targeted pedagogy. For example, that can help by allocating funds to these targeted methods of teaching that can help would mobilize only 2% of the actual spending on education, but then would increase by almost 2 years the average years of education, and increase the earnings by about 11%. Accordingly. So there is room, even in the current context where the finance is limited, with the ability to mobilize domestic resources through taxes or through a contract debt on capital markets. There is the possibility to better spend the existing funds that are available for education. So how to do this? We looked at country-specific strategies that can trigger a virtuous cycle of better skills for better jobs. So the first point here is that, as our director mentioned, is that we have huge aspirations for better work in high-skilled occupation. About 80% of African youth looking for a work in high-skilled occupation. But when we look at whether this demand is being met on the job market, only 8% find such jobs. So we looked at where most jobs are created, and as we all know, 85% of the workforce is in informality, and as you can see here, it's mainly jobs that are in agriculture, where the demand for skill is typically low, but also in wholesale retail trade, typically actually in urban cities, typically the type of job where, selling SIM cards or selling crops on urban markets, so which creates a lot of jobs, and where you have also medium to high skilled occupations. But as you can see on the left-hand quadrant, almost more than 85% of these jobs are vulnerable. So these are not stable jobs because they are largely informal, and they do not correspond to the aspirations of African youth for high-skilled occupation. When we look at mostly high-skilled occupation, so education, business, real estate, public administration, for instance, of course, they exist and jobs are being created there, but not sufficiently. And when we look at it, so they are much less, most of them are more stable jobs. So as you can see, there is less than 10% of them are in vulnerable employment. But compared with the number of jobs that are being created, it is not enough. When we estimate for the total number of people working in the informal workforce, we estimate that by 2050, we'll have 500 million more people in the informal employment. So here it's really key also to define skills for entrepreneurship, for family, for own account workers, that they have the right skills to develop their businesses, and that can also be incorporated in schools. When we looked at to what extent business skills are used or incorporated in curricula in schools, when we have an average between ranking from 0 to 5, on average on the African continent it's 2.5. But when we compare with Asia and developing Asia, it's 3.8. So when we compare with other countries in developing Asia, business skills are better incorporated in curricula as a school, and that's really important for the African continent when we look at the high number of youth coming to the job markets and to the education. About 34 million young people become 16 years old every year. Additionally, 34 million on average in the continent between now and 2040. So that's as many jobs that need to be created, and also places in training, in TVET, and in universities. Of course, this high implication for inequalities, particularly when we compare across different categories, men versus women. Here we have a lot of analysis on the disparities between men and women. We can highlight that women in some regions, for example, in North Africa, tend to have even better scores in mathematics, in reading, for example, but they tend to be less included in the job market. So when looking at the active population, women tends to be more excluded, and this is where just working on the side of the supply and then skills will not be enough. Because they tend to be better skills in some countries, but they're not finding the jobs. So it's about working hand in hand. When we also look at the distinction between cities and rural areas, of course, then the people in cities, urbanites, have better skill levels and have also are in better skilled occupations. So when we cross these inequalities together, the gender gap, the urban-rural or geographic gap, then we see that urban men compared to rural women tend to be a lot more favored compared to women, and which also could add to other types of inequalities, LGBT and people who are handicapped as well also face such inequalities. So really important to bear it in mind when looking at the analysis. The implications also are for migration. One implication is that there's a lot of migration within the continent. Of course, this will be also conduced with the African Continental Free Trade Area, although it's about trade, but that will higher trade, higher GDP will also lead to more migration. But this migration within Africa is mainly for lower skilled migrants. So there is room for policies to improve and to attract more better exchanges between migrants who are high skilled. And what we see today is that 17% of tertiary educated adults move to high income country. Well, we're living abroad, and 72% of them chose high income countries. When we look at certain regions, for example, East Africa, we have almost 50%, 47% actually, of people who are tertiary educated living outside the East African region, and 25% live in high income countries. So it's the highest share for all African regions, which also shows the gap between high growth in that region, in the East Africa region, but relatively small productivity gains while we have a high growth. So this is also testimony of the brain drain that affects the continent, and it's really important to find ways to generate platforms for exchanges. I think this center here is a great testimony for that, of course, and to ensure that there is a better matching between the skills demand and the skills supply on markets. And there are new skills that are being demanded. One type of new skills are, of course, digital skills, but also in renewable energy, but also in critical minerals. The mayor of Yokohama alluded also to waste management, where there is huge cooperation at the city level for recycling, but also digital is very important. So we looked, for example, at what the types of skills that will be in high demand in the future. And in Kenya, in Rwanda, for example, the demand for digital, in Côte d'Ivoire as well, in Ghana, the demand for digital skills is growing very rapidly. And we expect in the coming decades that we'll have actually the demand for advanced skills will move to more than half of the jobs requiring advanced digital skills. So how to develop policies for effective skills development? So we argue that we need to balance different types of objectives. One is inclusion, of course, but high productivity and employment potential is also crucial. Why? Because if we don't find these three balance between these different factors, the job creation may happen in sectors with high potential for productivity enhancement, for example, mining, but not many jobs could potentially be created there. Or on the contrary, having jobs that are created in sectors that are a lot more inclusive, but with little productivity enhancement being possible. So the key is for every country to, according to the comparative advantages, to strike the right balance between these different principles to be able to have the right type of skills development, meeting the demand of the private sector. So first, we looked at national strategies. So of course, as OECD, as an economist, a statistician, requiring more data is not surprising, but we have great examples of that in the report. For example, Kenya could develop a very good strategy for skills development by analyzing the type of skills that were demanded, analyzing the type of skills mismatches, particularly for the digital sector that we mentioned before, singling out priority sectors also for farming. I know Ethiopia has done also similar types of programs for TVET on the cut flowers industry, for example, and looking at how digital skills can be incorporated there. So a lot of example there. Second, expanding the quality of education, because as our macroeconomic models showed, there is a lot of benefits to be created by having universal education from an economic perspective, but also it's a human rights, and it's particularly important for girls also to postpone the age of childbearing. Expanding quality expansion is really important. We have great examples, for example, in Morocco that conducted in 2008 the PISA and then was able to benchmark its education systems according to the outcomes, the quality of the learnings, and benchmark itself with other peers, international peers, internationally. So that can also be, as an example, particularly useful. Third, developing training and skills recognition, which is particularly important where we have a very high share of informality on the continent. Because let's take an example. In Swami magazine in the Ghana, for example, for decades we've had spare parts for the automotive industry being created and exported informally to other parts, to other countries in Africa, to South Africa, to Côte d'Ivoire, to Nigeria, and so forth and so on. But the issue is that these are largely, we have what, about 250,000 entrepreneurs developing this automotive industry there, but the skills are developed informally in family firms and not recognized. So having the type of skills recognition will enable them to move to different types of firms, different activities, and increase the productivity. And we have many examples of that on the continent, in Capo Verde, in Côte d'Ivoire, in Togo, in many examples in Rwanda, in Kenya as well, of how to develop recognition of prior learning and certificates. Another key dimension, of course, is TVET. TVET is key to involve the private sector in TVET education. We estimated that across the continent, only 30% of the teachers conducting TVET training had actual experience in the sector in which they were teaching. So making sure that train the trainers and having the right type of skills with the right hands-on experience is really key, upgrading curricula as well. And we have great examples, for example, of South Africa using renewable energy, digital skills, and incorporating these new skills in the TVET curriculum reform to adapt the skills to the new demands of the job market. Now, of course, South Africa is a special case. The informality is much lower there than in other African countries, but this is why we need tailored approach and tailored strategy at the country level. And finally, of course, regional integration is very important to ensure that migration can be through harmonized system, and skill recognition and portability of skills can improve the matching of talent and skills on the continent. Mr. Chair, how much time do I have? Just to be mindful of the time. 5 minutes. Okay, perfect. I have 5 regional chapters, so one minute per chapter. So in West Africa, a region that is particularly important for Japan, as we saw, we have, for each of the regional chapters in the report, we have case studies at the sectorial level. So for West Africa, because of the high demographic growth, agri-food is particularly important. We have very high demand also for local products, for cashew nuts, for igname, for of course for export markets, cocoa beans and coffee, as we know, but particularly for local products and rice that can be consumed domestically within the region. So that's particularly important. Also because there is a very high rate of wastage of food. 25% of the food is wasted because of poor logistics, particularly in the cold chain, for example, and so that can be improved by improving the skills and the education in the sector. Indeed, what we see is that while a huge improvement has been made for the skills development, there is still huge gaps between men and women, but also to have skills that are really practical and advanced, for example, through education in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and also to bridge inequalities. So we looked also at the skills shortages for very particular segments of the food, for example, for industrial engineers, for meat packing, or also in the logistics supply chain. And we found out that support skills, particularly in logistics, could also be improved to improve the supply chain, reduce food shortages. And this is also a case where technical recognition of prior learning, for example, in Nigeria, in Benin, has enabled to increase productivity and by training a lot of entrepreneurs in the agri-food business. A second region is mining sector in Southern Africa that is, of course, led to some extent by South Africa, but we have great examples here also of cooperation between different countries of different regions. So, for example, Zambia in the copper sector has created a training center to attract talent also coming from the Congo that exports most of the 70% of the world's 69% of the world's cobalt comes from the Congo, but is not being transformed. So the ambition of the Zambia was there to create this training center to be able to develop the skills base locally to then transform the mining industry. And this is very important because this critical mining through global demand in mobile phone, new technologies and so forth and so on. The world needs these minerals coming from Africa, but what we need is also local transformation happening on the ground in the African countries. If we again take in the case of the Congo in Central Africa, sorry, the most of the processing is not done in the region, it's done in China. So there's really very important to transform more. Finally, in East Africa, we looked at digital skills. That will change the labor markets. For example, in Kenya and Rwanda, we projected that the advanced skills will make 29% of the demand by 2030. So in almost 5 years from now. So it's really important. But at the same time, countries need to tailor their needs to their comparative advantages. So if you look at Kenya, for example, is a country that is exporting a lot of services in ICT, but much less when we compare to also countries that are doing fairly well, like Rwanda, that has been really a front runner in artificial intelligence, but is exporting less in aggregate value compared to Ethiopia or Kenya, for example. North Africa, we looked at the renewable energy for productive jobs, and where there's huge advances made by Morocco as a great example from the region. And finally, to conclude, the Central Africa chapter also looks at the mining industry, but I already mentioned it before. I will close it because of the time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Minsat, for a very, very rich presentation of the findings of the report and also for keeping on time. Now we'll move on to the next part of this session, and we have invited colleagues from the World Bank to present one piece of analytical work on Africa and jobs. We have Aya Magub and Anchal Anand, sorry, who will be making the presentation on cities for jobs and growth. Aya is a senior urban development specialist in the World Bank. She is lead of the Cities for Jobs and Growth program of the World Bank's Urban Global Solutions Group. She has been working on programs and projects, also analytical work in the Latin America and Caribbean region, and also in the Middle East and North Africa region. Prior to the World Bank, she worked at Harvard, the Center for Global Development Innovation Ventures in USAID, and she completed her undergraduate and graduate studies in Harvard, while Anand is a senior urban economist. She is leading work in over 20 countries in Africa, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia, and also in MENA, Middle East and East Africa. She holds her master's in economics from Johns Hopkins of Advanced International Studies. So Aya and Ancha, please.
Hello, everyone. It's an honor to be here with you all and to get to present after such an excellent presentation. Congratulations on the report. Today, Anchal and I are going to speak to you about some developing work that we're doing at the World Bank on the role of cities in enabling jobs and growth, including in Africa. So we're going to give a quick run through the global work, the impetus for it, the framework we're developing, and some examples of interventions we've supported around the world that give a flavor of what it looks like. And then Anchal is going to speak to Africa specifically. So to start with, we wanted to share some of the big numbers that keep us up at night. As you know, in Africa, as elsewhere in the world, the demand for good jobs is outstripping the supply of good jobs. And we know that cities play a critical role in both defining the effective labor market that most people can access, but also in scaling up jobs. And so in terms of those big numbers, in 2023, the global job gap was about 435 million jobs, massive. And every month from 2020 to 2030, it was estimated that about 3.7 million youth would enter working age. So this is in a context where we already can't generate enough jobs, good jobs, for people who are already in the labor force or want to enter the labor force. We know that cities are powerhouses for job creation. Between 2010 and 2020, about 88% of private sector jobs were created in cities, and that number has been growing over time. And as most of you know, moving to a bigger city typically leads to more take-home income. What we see, though, is that there's a lot of variation in how much more the urban wage premium is when one moves to a city. So for example, in Indonesia, where we've done some analytical work recently, we found that in some cities, that urban wage premium can be up to 30%. But as you can see here, the global average from meta-analyses that we've done is about 6.5%. And that's because in actually a lot of cities in the developing world, the negative externalities associated with density that isn't where there isn't capacity to manage that density effectively is muting the positive benefits of agglomeration economies of density. So obviously, for our entire history, jobs have been an important part of the narrative of what it is that we focus on as an objective, as an institution. But right now, as of the past year, our president is placing extreme emphasis on this agenda and our need to really step up in our support. And you can see this permeating all of our corporate strategies, all of our, major kind of North Star orienting documents within the institution. And most recently, 2 months ago, he announced a new high-level council to tackle the looming jobs crisis. That's literally what it's called, presided by the president of Singapore and one of the former presidents of Chile. And in parallel to placing such a strong emphasis on our need to scale up our support for job creation around the world, we are releasing in the months to come a new institutional flagship report called Jobs for Development. And now Jobs for Development is meant to be an update of our 2013 World Development Report on jobs. What we find within the urban practice extremely exciting about this new flagship report is that for the first time in our history as an institution, cities are taking a central role in the framework for thinking about what's needed to create jobs at scale. And you can see here the framework. Cities feature in two parts of the framework. One is a framework on the dimensions of jobs transformation. Those dimensions are sectoral, spatial, organizational, and occupational. So in that spatial pillar, we see the evolution from rural dominant economies towards more urban economies. And then in the solution space, there are three solution spaces. They're places, production, and people. And so within places, you see the key role of cities. And why is it that cities are so important, right? I think everyone here knows, so I won't spend too much time on this slide, but as I mentioned, we do observe an urban wage premium in cities around the world, and it varies. And that is attributed to the fact that cities enable productivity gains. They enable more sharing, more learning, more matching, that allows for people and for firms to be able to level up. And when we talk about firms, typically in cities, they have access to better amenities, they have access to larger markets typically, and people typically have access to better educational services, health services, and other resources needed to live a good life and be able to contribute. But as I mentioned earlier, urban costs can be really substantial. And what we've observed is more recently in cities in developing countries that we're seeing a lot more sterile agglomerations that are having costs that are so much higher than the benefits. And just to give you a flavor of the magnitude that we're talking about, in a recent study that we did, we found that there tends to be homicide rates that are about 4 times on average the homicide rates that you see in cities in industrialized countries. Typically, hours spent in congestion are on average 19 to 30% higher than they would be in cities in industrialized countries. People tend to be exposed to more pollution, 16 to 28% more exposure on average. And typically regulatory requirements end up slowing down a lot of processes. In the case of construction permits, we see that it typically takes, on average, 2 times the amount of time, but that number can vary dramatically also. I see you nodding your head, you know. And so we produced a framework that accompanies the broader jobs framework that's oriented towards decision makers thinking about cities. And that can be national decision makers thinking about systems of cities, but it can also be subnational decision makers thinking about specific cities. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but this framework offers guidance, and there's a lot more behind it, to guide the constraints analysis, to understand what is really acting as a bottleneck to these cities enabling production. And there's a theory of change. This is the generalized version of it. It has to be adapted in each context, but it's another tool that decision makers can use and development partners can use to identify what are the types of interventions that respond to the key constraints, and then what is the objective of those interventions, what kinds of outputs, outcomes, and impacts are sought. Okay. And just to give you an idea of what it looks like for governments to take this agenda on, I'm going to share 4 examples at different spatial scales. As I mentioned, the framework we're developing is new as of the past few months, and results take a lot of time. So none of the examples I'm sharing are based on that framework, but they're based on previous frameworks that were very similar in nature. And we'll give you an idea of what kinds of results can be achieved when there is a strong intention to make change on the ground. So the first scale is the national scale, and it's an example of our support to the government of Georgia in Europe. The government decided that a key priority was to increase access to economic opportunity in lagging areas. And their theory of change was that the tourism sector would be one way to do this. And so starting a little bit before 2010, they asked for our support, and we've been supporting them since 2010 in 6 successive loans to the sector, amounting to about $200 million altogether, for interventions to improve infrastructure, basic services, the facades of historical buildings, amenities that tourists come to seek, and technical assistance for value chain development for the small and medium-sized enterprises that engage in the tourism value chain, and support for public-private initiatives and private capital mobilization. And to give you a sense of the results, and this is just a snapshot from the most recent years, the number of jobs that have been tracked and created that are directly attributable to interventions over the past 4 years are 3,500 direct jobs created in the tourism and agriculture sectors. Specifically, we've observed private capital mobilization at a 1-to-20 ratio linked to specific investments in territories that were prioritized under this latest phase of the project. And it's estimated that it will take the government about 3 years to recoup the cost of the financing that they borrowed. So fairly quick. Then at the within country scale, the regional scale, we've been supporting the government of Egypt to introduce an innovative way to empower subnational authorities to identify constraints to economic development and to begin to take action in a coordinated manner to unlock the potential of these territories. Their focus initially was on lagging areas, so some of the hardest to see results in. And they wanted to start slowly and progress over time. So in 2017, we started financing pilots in 2 governorates, and after several years, when they started to see results, they scaled it up and added 2 more governorates. Now they're in discussions with us to add additional financing and scale it up more broadly in the country. The interventions that are financed, first, in terms of scale, there's about $1 billion of financing that's going to these 4 governorates, roughly 50-50 split between Government of Egypt resources and World Bank financing. And it's financing interventions in cluster development, clusters of potential in these governorates, which range from agribusiness clusters to textile clusters to some renewable energy solutions. Regulatory simplifications in these governorates, interventions to improve industrial zones, so both infrastructure investments and changes in management, incentives for better subnational government performance, and increases in infrastructure investment for the populations of these governorates. And in terms of results to date, there are about 50,000 businesses benefiting from better industrial zones and or being addressed through the cluster development strategies, with about an 85% satisfaction rate among those that have been surveyed. There are about 5,130 investments in infrastructure and services, reaching about 8 million people, with about an 82% satisfaction rate. And then at the city level, Casablanca is another example of interest. Egypt and Casablanca are two examples from Africa. And so in Casablanca, the government approached us asking for support for them to increase municipal investment capacity, improve their business environment, increase their resilience to climate change, and improve access to basic services and infrastructure among their population. So since 2016, we've supported them with $300 million of financing for, again, that infrastructure and service upgrades, to finance digital platforms and process re-engineering to simplify the regulatory environment, and with support for private capital mobilization. And some of the results we've seen from 2016 until last year are about a 40% increase in municipal revenues, about 940 million Moroccan dinars in private capital mobilized, almost a halving of the time that's needed to acquire a building permit, and about 8,000 households benefiting from improved infrastructure and services. And finally, at the neighborhood scale, again, focusing on some of the hardest challenges that our counterparts focus on, we have an example from Argentina. The city of Buenos Aires decided that it wanted to introduce a major program to integrate physically, economically, and socially people from one of the most disadvantaged neighborhoods in the city. And so we financed at the tune of $170 million from 2016 until last year, their vision, which included improving basic infrastructure and service access for these 40,000 residents of the neighborhood, improving housing, community assets, introducing a local development institution, and the programming associated with that. And on the local development institution side, it's a super interesting approach that they took, where they focused on taking out a narcotics market in the middle of the neighborhood and putting in its place a beautiful building that became this local development institution. And through that institution, they've been offering labor market intermediation, value chain development focused on the neighborhood, and a focus on crowding in private investments into this neighborhood. And so some of the results that they've been able to measure from 2016 until last year are that roughly half the residents of the neighborhood, almost 20,000 people, have received some kind of training support from this center. And they've had 11,000 graduates from various educational programs that they offer. They've been able to place about 2,000 people in formal private sector jobs who previously did not have them. They have supported almost 900 economic establishments within the neighborhood itself, and about 200 of them agreed to formalize those enterprises, which is quite rare and difficult to do. And last, this neighborhood where no one from the outside would have entered 8 years ago now has a bit of a tourism industry going on that's being facilitated by some of the small and medium-sized enterprises that emerged from the support from the government, and they've recorded almost 5,000 tourist visits over the past few years. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Anshel to share with you the perspective from Africa.
Thank you very much, Aya. Esteemed colleagues and guests, allow me to continue the presentation on what's specifically going on in Africa. So what is holding African cities back when it comes to job creation? Urbanization of people in Africa has not been accompanied by the urbanization of capital. What that means is that Africa actually started to urbanize at a lower GDP per capita level than other countries. So it was only 1,000 in terms of $1,000 GDP per capita compared to, say, 3,500 in LAC. This has meant that there has been lower investment in key infrastructure. So for example, in housing sector alone, Africa has invested only 5 to 6.5%, depending on the country, of their GDP on housing, whereas you see that number being 5.5 to 9% in other parts of the world. The other point is that the population density in Africa has not translated into economic density. So as my colleague Aya was presenting earlier, you have an issue with congestion, you have an issue with traffic jams, people not being able to get to their jobs, people being exposed to higher pollution levels. And that's really a result of this population density not being transformed into economic density. You don't have livable cities, as they say, in Africa. And what you in fact see is that 60% of the population in urban population in Africa lives in slums, compared to only 34% in other regions. You see this big gap in livability, and you have population density and crowding that's not translating into economic density and economic growth. The third point here is fragmented spatial form. Now you might wonder, what does urban planning and spatial form have to do with jobs? Now cities, as I was mentioning, play a very critical role in matching in the labor markets. You have the demand side and the supply side. The cities tend to bring these people together, lower cost for firms to find the right type of employees and skilled labor. But you don't see that in Africa as much because you have fragmented spatial form. African cities, in fact, tend to be 20% more fragmented than cities in other regions. And to state two examples of Harare in Zimbabwe and Maputo in Mozambique, you see that 30% of the land within 5 kilometers of the central business district is unbuilt. This is a huge problem. This happens in other cities. For example, Paris, there's also unbuilt land, but these are green parks, public spaces that create greater livability, create social cohesion. But that is untapped potential in African cities that's going on. There's also barriers to tradables. Why are tradables important? Tradable goods are goods that allow you to access markets beyond what the domestic demand is. And it's simply because of fragmented spatial form, because of the higher cost of investment, simply too difficult and too costly for African cities to start leaning more into tradables. In fact, Luanda is one city where the economy is 70% non-tradables. So on the right-hand side, you'll see the chart of tradable versus non-tradable, and African cities on average have only 50% of tradables in their economy versus 70% for Asian cities. And if I may turn your attention to the left-hand side of the chart, this is what Dr. Minsat was saying. You have rising urbanization levels in Africa that have not translated into higher economic growth. And those are the reasons why. Now allow me to go back to the framework that Aya had presented, the people, production, and places framework. And let me give you some examples of both analytical work and operational work that the World Bank is doing in Africa, West, Central, Eastern, and Southern to target, to help decision makers and target better job creation. So allow me to start with Juba, South Sudan. So the map you see here, hot off the press, we built it just about 2 weeks ago. And that shows the spatial density of jobs in the city of Juba. Why do we look at a machine learning method to find the spatial density of job? Because the former enterprise survey that we have is actually from 2014. A lot of urbanization has happened and a lot of data gets missed if you only are able to access those formal resources that are available from time to time. What this allows us to do is we see that there's actually a pretty good fit between the spatial distribution of jobs and where those enterprises are located. And this allows us to start targeting investments, specifically resilient urbanization investments. We care about this because climate change, urban floods are highly disruptive to economic activity and can disrupt the economic fabric of cities. So what this would allow us to do under the competitiveness pillar of the work in South Sudan is to target investments around market upgrades, paved footpaths, roads, associated drainage in areas where you see a higher density of jobs. And we, of course, plan to target local economic development strategies and capacity building of government along with those investments. Next, let's go to the city of Kigali in Rwanda. the World Bank financed the first Rwanda urban development project, which targeted the Agatare informal settlement, which was about 111 hectares, and had 19,000 people as beneficiaries. What you see as a result of this transformation of the neighborhood is that 6.6 kilometers of streets were built, 1.5 kilometers of street lighting, major associated drainage and footpaths, and it's completely transformed the neighborhood. In fact, if you go to the city of Kigali, I highly recommend you to visit it. It's called Nyamirambo. It's now a car-free zone. And it becomes this like very lively place at night. There's music, there's food, there's people dancing in the street. You have beautiful wall art, the murals. And in fact, if you go to the tourism sites in the city of Kigali, this shows up. They also invested in early childhood development centers. It was not tracked because it went beyond the time of the project, but we have anecdotal evidence that improved women's labor market participation because they were able to spend more hours per day outside their homes. Moving on to production, this is the Mpumalanga province in South Africa. It's an economy that's highly dependent on coal. As part of the just transition and the roadmap for inclusive economic diversification and transformation, the RIDAT, the province is now diversifying its economy. It has a diverse set of settlements, small towns, villages, but also a few key cities, and we're anchoring investments to move the economy of Mpumalanga away from coal, invest in key sectors like tourism, agriculture, and manufacturing. And the draft employment strategy that has been developed predicts that there will be 100,000 new jobs created in the next 5 to 6 years. Of course, these are important challenges. The phase down is critical, but requires capacity building and giving those people different jobs. So a lot of retraining in terms of skills. And to address these challenges, Mpumalanga is going to be prioritizing both spatially targeted approaches in those places, a people-centric approach on the skills that are needed for the new jobs, reskilling of those that have had the coal jobs, and then, of course, strengthening of institutions and collaborations. Next up, let's go to the island of Zanzibar in Tanzania. There's a big inclusive growth in Zanzibar project, literally called Big Z. You're allowed to laugh. And there's the biggest component of the Big Z project has a $24 million investment subcomponent on integrated local area development. It targets 3 gateway villages on the island of Unguja. And the idea here is skill building for 1,200 villagers. Now, what does this really mean in terms of the frameworks that we have talked about through Dr. Minsad and Aya's presentations? We know that urbanization leads to structural transformation, but that doesn't happen without the right skills. What happens in Zanzibar is that a lot of tourists, so international demand, goes to resorts, and these are all-inclusive resorts. They almost never even leave the resorts. So the local communities don't benefit from tourism, which is about 30% of the GDP of Zanzibar. So what this program intends to do is that alongside investments that are more, you would say, urban area investments, it plans to train these 1,200 people, the villagers, that helps them to economically integrate with the rest of the economy of Zanzibar. And programs that are being targeted under livelihood support include market facilities, improvements to public spaces, improved footpaths and walkways to some local attractions, including the Baobab Forest. So you see that structural transformation element and the skill building element coming in all together. Allow me to also talk about labor-intensive public works. Now, I know this is not the big bang agglomeration economies, power of cities. These are construction jobs, typically low to medium skills, but these are still important because they target the urban poor. And as you know, World Bank has a mandate and a goal of eradicating poverty. So these are jobs directly targeted at the urban poor in informal settlements. We track that 12 World Bank finance projects had high to medium relevance jobs that were created, construction jobs that were created in a variety of African countries, including Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana. And projects range from urban roads to drainage, flood defenses, building of landfill, sanitation facilities, and tourism. So yes, these are not the jobs we're going for, but these are still jobs. This brings food to the table. This targets the urban poor, so they're important, and we're doing a better job to track them. Next up, let's move from public works to digital public works. And I know Dr. Minsad mentioned a lot about the need for digital skills. So this is something that I think targets that. The World Bank has a Resilience Academy, and the digital public works are essentially a participatory manner with which young students and people living in informal settlements earn an income by collecting data points, filling out digital data sets, and then processing those data sets to create, for example, a GIS road layer. When you do an overlay of that GIS road layer with, say, what areas of this informal settlement are flood prone, you know exactly where to build the drainage. So these are ways to improve resilient urbanization while also creating digital skills and giving jobs to people. An example from the second informal settlements improvement project in Kenya gave 300 youth participants across 3 target settlements jobs. They created about 210,000 spatial and socioeconomic data sets, which is quite impressive and helps with the targeting of investments in those projects. Approximately $50,000 worth of money was given out during this process, but another $250,000 was estimated to be given over the course of the project. Now, a few key takeaways, things that hopefully you will all remember. I want to mention that cities, we care about cities because they're escalators out of poverty, and they are key to creating more and better jobs and help Africa move out of the low development trap that it finds itself in. I would like to also mention that, as has been noted by Dr. Minsad and in the OECD report, there is an urban skills premium. In fact, the OECD report goes as far as to say that there are high-skilled jobs if you can find the right people with the right skills to fill them. So I think this is an incredible opportunity for us to invest in the right infrastructure, the right urban planning, fix issues around urban form that allows for that labor market matching to happen more easily, and support the overall job creation in Africa. I would like to take you back to opening remarks from Takami-san. You had mentioned that this is a pivotal moment in Africa. This is true. There is a demographic dividend. And if you don't invest in this demographic dividend and you don't improve access to jobs, access to schools, you will lose the opportunity. We, in fact, will lose this opportunity. So this is absolutely a critical moment, and we need to do more than what we're already doing. We also need to track things better. I think sometimes we are doing things, we're just not tracking them, and all of those initiatives would help us. Private sector-led job creation is really critical, and public sector actions that enable for the private sector to come in will remain critical. This is also how we will create medium to higher skilled jobs in Africa. There's, of course, the low skilled jobs that I mentioned, the labor intensive public works, and that also represents an enormous opportunity in Africa. If you think about the housing deficit, if you think about the economic opportunity of in situ upgrading programs, so those jobs will exist, but I think there's more need to bring in private sector through an enabling environment. Last but not least, the World Bank and other development partners, OECD, JICA, the African Union, et cetera, can support African countries with both short to medium to long-term skill building and structural changes. So I cannot emphasize enough that this is not just the structural transformation of the economy, but also the urban form, the urban planning of cities to connect people better to support the jobs agenda. That's it for me. Thank you very much. Arigato.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and everyone here in the conference room, and also those in the connected online. I'm Setsuko Saya, and thank you for coming to this event. Since we have reception is waiting for us at 6:30, I would definitely like to conclude by the reception. But we like to continue our discussion on skills and employment and productivity, because it is a very interesting topic, and of course the urban environment needs more skills development, and urban area creates more jobs and premium for workers is a very important topic. So we'd like to continue our discussion. But since this topic of skills development, employment, and urban environment is a very, very complex issue that requires the collaboration of many different sectors, just to name a few: urban policies, rural policies, gender, digital, industrial transformation, education, and agriculture policies or public transportation policies. So I invited those speakers from very diverse background so that we can collaborate each sector's different expertise to the skills, employment, and urban development. So the session is now structured in two rounds. The first round, we talk about the challenges and actions, how each speaker's background, industries, or sectors are taking. And then important, the skills development and employment is very important, but where those skills or employment happens is also a very interesting topic where we discussed with the World Bank colleagues report. So let's think about how we can accommodate those employment and jobs. Maybe the rural area is also the place to accommodate those employment, because Africa, maybe 50% of the urbanization happens in Africa, meaning that the rest of the 50s are in rural areas. And the second round of discussion is that how each different players' approaches can be coordinated so that to avoid very, very mismatch of different approaches of players, to avoid the congestion, but to increase more synergies among different players. So having said that, I want to immediately start with the first round of discussion and inviting the first speaker. He's ambassador of Cote d'Ivoire to Japan. And as it is everybody knows, but Cote d'Ivoire is the second largest economy in Africa, in the West Africa. And also, maybe you don't know, but gender is very advanced in Cote d'Ivoire. According to OECD Development Center statistics, we call it SIGI database, Cote d'Ivoire is the best gender balanced country in Africa. So maybe from that perspective also, we can hear your experience. And so what is your challenges? What kind of actions are you taking? And what kind of skills are you mostly needed in your country? We have to ask you 5 minutes. I will strictly expect you to 5 minutes so that we can enjoy the cocktail. So, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Moderator. I'm very honored.
Oh, please use my microphone.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Moderator. And it's an honor for me to be part of this event with all the distinguished co-panelists. Let me also thank the special representative of Japan to the World Bank, the director of OECD Development Center, and the Deputy Director General of International Cooperation Bureau of MOFA. And let me thank also the other co-organizers for this timely event. As you said, Cote d'Ivoire is a West African country, which economy is essentially based on agriculture. We are the first producer of cocoa, the first producer of cashew nuts, and agriculture contribute for 23% of the GDP, and around 43% of total labor force, and 2/3 of export revenue. In this regard, the Ministry of the Environment and Sustainable Development has launched a program in 2019 for skill development and integration of young people, which account for 75% of the total population. in green professions and jobs. This program has resulted in the drawing of a catalog of green skills and jobs based on two types of activities, namely the greening activities, which are traditional economic activities carried out using processes that pollute less or consume less energy and resources, such as in agriculture, transport, tourism, housing, industry, etc. And also eco activities, which purpose is to protect the environment and manage natural resources, such as forestry, waste, sanitation, renewable energy, etc. 18 professions has been identified in 3 sectors as follows to achieve sustainable development in Côte d'Ivoire. 3 professions in the primary sector that are organic farmer, nurseryman, horticulturists. 6 professions in secondary sector, waste recyclers, bioenergy producers, producers of improved stoves, master composters, and 9 professions finally in the tertiary sector, ecotourism guide, landscaper, waste exchange manager, eco builder, etc., etc. How younger generation are responding to those needs? Generally speaking, young people are responding to employment needs by joining training centers with employment and integration programs. Thousands of young people have been trained in professions related to the production of organic fertilizers and compost to reduce the use of chemical inputs. In the field of renewable energy, students were trained in renewable energy production and maintenance, as well as in energy audit techniques for construction and industry. Young people also take part in careers days organized by the Ministry for Youth, Professional Integration and Civic Service in partnership with universities. These meetings are dedicated to promoting jobs in order to increase young people's knowledge of the ecosystem and provide them with internship and job opportunities. As a result, young people have a better understanding of careers, and job opportunities in the green job sector, enhance their skills in job-seeking techniques. Several young people were also recruited as trainees in the green economy. How does the government act to create jobs and skill development for younger people? The government, under the leadership of President Alassane Ouattara, created a dedicated Ministry of Youth, Professional Integration and Civic Service, responsible for implementing the government youth program over the period 2023-2025 with a budget amounting around $2 billion US. The main objective of this program is to develop young people's skills to meet the labor market demand.
So now you have 1 minute.
Just 1 minute left. Ivorian government has also mobilized and involved all stakeholders, such as education, ecosystem ministries, local authorities, and so on. So other actions have been undertaken, in particular, developing training and skills reference frameworks for a better understanding and appropriation of these professions, developing business plans for all these professions to determine the economic and financial viability, and finally, developing integration plans for young people in local and rural areas. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Your country has a very comprehensive and formal training for young people that leads to green transition. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you. Next speaker is online. Thomas, can you hear me? Okay. Thomas is Special Advisor for Private Sector and SDG Finance in the African region from UNDP. He is stationed in Johannesburg. And thank you for joining us from early in the morning. And I want to hear UNDP's approach on green business in Africa. So could you please start your speech? And I'd like you to limit 5 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, moderator, and event organizers, OECD, the World Bank, and all the participants. We're very grateful for this opportunity to join this conversation. As it was said, my name is Thomas Sales, and I'm part of the UNDP team here in South Africa that is working with all our 46 country office in Sub-Saharan Africa. On the topic of green business in Africa, maybe I should, start by saying we understand green business, that green business targets and supports sustainable development outcomes without degrading the environment, but rather positively supporting climate action, biodiversity. For us, we believe that the green economy is still at a nascent phase in Sub-Saharan Africa. Its importance is due to the following reasons: environmental protection, economic resilience and diversification, social inclusion, climate change mitigation and adaptation, and biodiversity positive outcomes. The green economy is extremely important also from the point of view of creating jobs. The key sectors for the green economy in Africa include renewable energy, water, waste management, related green infrastructure, sustainable agriculture, food production, forestry, nature-based solutions, ecotourism, and a whole series of new technologies, which we call green or digital green technologies. We have produced this year, and I will invite you participants to take a look at the flyer, a brand new report which speaks to the subject of green business and how to finance green business in Africa. This report, among other findings, says that Africa is uniquely poised to be a global leader and redefine the landscape of the green economy. This is because Africa is endowed with vast natural resources, and above all, let me stress this, a young, dynamic population that can hold the key to drive the green revolution. And through this, we can create employment and economic resilience. Needless to say, I think some colleagues mentioned this early on, the demographics, the youthful and growing labor force, it's a critical factor. A successful and timely green transition, it's a necessity for Africa as it grapples with the dual challenge caused by the increasingly extreme impacts of climate change and the imperatives of continuing economic growth. This transition represents a golden opportunity to pursue alternative growing models, leapfrog generations of technology, and build a more inclusive, sustainable, and resilient future. In this regard, I want to make it clear that public capital flows alone will not be sufficient, hence the importance of bringing the private sector. Private finance and international finance is key to unlocking the green economy and business opportunities in Africa. We believe that so far progress has been slow due to barriers and challenges, including the lack of green investment, access, adequate policies and regulatory issues, inadequate infrastructure, and the lack of awareness, capacity, technologies, and yes, smart incentives. Therefore, we believe there is a strong need for concerted action and greater action in the area of green economy. to address both the challenge and the opportunities. I think that it's also important that we take the two imperatives in a dynamic manner. There is a huge opportunity for innovative public as well as public and private solutions to drive the growth of green business and financing in the region. This is my attempt to respond to your first question. I'll be happy to speak at length.
Thomas. Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you. Thank you for pointing out how to finance for green jobs and green transition is very important. And thank you for raising the importance of private finance. Let's keep moving on to the third speaker. He's Osamu Kawanishi, Director Head, Asia External Research Representation Office in AFDB. I think you're very uniquely positioned to see Africa from the Asian perspective. So I really like to hear your actions. Thank you, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My name is Osamu Kawanishi. Thank you for kind introduction, the Saya-san. And also it's a great honor to be here as one of the panelists. And the headquarters of the AFDB is Abidjan. And so very great honor to be sitting to the ambassador. So I'd like to make 3 points. First, I share with all the participants the importance of skill development. Now, Africa needs to harness the brain power of its young and dynamic population and to promote technological revolution, economic competitiveness, and prosperity. And the increase in skilled middle-level human capital across Africa is a key element, especially for attracting private investment. And to this end, the African Development Bank attaches great importance on skill development and support, for example, establishing centers of excellence in higher education, science and technology, and building and maintaining science and technology infrastructure and linking it to productive sectors, production sectors, as well as providing financing for education, including technical vocational training. So in terms of Japan's contribution in this space, in addition to being the fourth largest shareholder, there is a program called the Japan Dream Scholarship Program, we call JAZ. And the JAZ program is a capacity building project initiated by the African Development Bank and Japanese government and launched in 2017 to grant 2-year scholarship to high achieving African students to pursue the postgraduate master course degree at Japanese universities, and in priority development areas, including energy, agriculture, health, and engineering, for example. The secondary, in order to address these dual challenges, many previous speakers already mentioned, and we consider that the holistic approach is very important. So African Development Bank has identified 5 strategic priorities, namely, first, Feed Africa, which is concerned with agricultural production and productivity. And the second, Light Up and Power Africa, which is concerned with access to electricity. And the third, the Industrialized Africa. And the fourth, Integrated Africa. And the fifth, and last but not least, that improves the quality of life and the people of Africa. So to create a sufficient number of quality job opportunities, we consider that we need to industrialization led by private sector. And that this industrialization needs to be underpinned by well-established infrastructure, including electricity and water supply, and the transportation, and the decent quality of life of people, including health and the medical system. So we expect that pursuing these 5 strategic priorities simultaneously in a holistic approach, promote enabling environment for further private investment, and then create the job opportunities. Thirdly, yes, in terms of the sustainable investment from private sectors to African continent, the African Development Bank has made the private sector development are one of the key priorities for reducing poverty and supporting sustainable growth on the continent. So we consider that private sector development needs to be led by the combination of 3 pillars: improving investment and business climate, second, the enhancing access to social and economic infrastructure, and the third, fostering enterprise development. So as a premier international development bank in Africa, the African Development Bank offers diverse very many of financial options depending on the circumstance of the financial requirement of each borrower. The bank financial solutions include loans and credit lines of credit, and then second, guarantee and equity and quasi-equity, the hybrid finances and the trade finance. So in addition, the bank also provides the grant funds to the as a technical assistance. So for example, through these financial instruments, the FDB plays a very active and important role in the developing private sector, for example, in Kotojiba, for example, and by providing opportunities to develop the skills of the using the latest equipment and management skills to promote export competitiveness, and thereby providing job opportunities for people, including youth and women in particular. And I will stop here, but AFDB, African Development Bank, is very much willing to continue to play an instrumental role of the skill development and the private sector development. Thank you very much.
And congratulations for the very successful programs. And thank you for pointing out private sector's involvement is very important in very diverse perspectives. That's very good point. And fourth speaker, thank you for waiting. He is Mr. Shuhei Ueno. He's a Deputy Director General of Africa Department from JICA. So I'm sure that JICA thinks Africa as a great partners. You have very many projects, programs, infrastructure investment. So I'm really like to hear, what do you think about the skills, necessary skills? What are you doing in Africa for the skills development? Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. First, before going to the skill development, I'd like to touch upon job. Job is very much important agenda for, of course, for Africa. If I had to limit one answer, how can we provide more jobs for Africa? I would say dynamic private sector. How can we achieve this dynamic private sector? There are many factors. That is a difficulty. Of course, well, I think World Bank presentation points out that, of course, government support necessary, political stability, healthy macroeconomic situation. JICA, we often say TIF. That's how we do to create more dynamic private sector from the experience of what we have done in Asia. T, training, so human development. I, infrastructure, and F, finance. That we have learned from our experience of doing our cooperation to Asia, and now we would like to promote this TIF to create more dynamic private sector. That's first one. But when it comes to skill development, I think that many previous speakers mentioned Kaizen, so I should touch upon the Kaizen. JICA, as an agency, Japanese governmental agency for development cooperation, we would like to share the knowledge of Japan's development. Japan used to be a developing countries. We quickly developed our nation, and we would like to share our knowledge. And their Kaizen, direct translation, is continuous improvement. The concept was born in Japanese automobile companies such as Toyota, Nissan. With that, Japanese automobile companies grew their companies and made Japanese development quick economic growth. So now we have been, I think, pointed out, we have shared this Kaizen to 27 African countries. We noticed that this concept, we could observe the increase of companies' productivity by 65%. I was in Tunisia until last year, and there we shared the Kaizen not only with the Tunisian people, but we also trained Tunisian Kaizen instructor. And now they have 100 instructors. They can teach Kaizen to Tunisian companies. And now they teach Kaizen to neighboring countries, such as Libya. So that's the first one. The second one, after hearing the many speakers' ideas, there's a gap, of course, between the demand and supply when it comes to the job. There's a gap when it comes to TVET, what school teaches and what companies want. How can we, reduce this gap? It's just my personal observation, but I would say young people's aspiration. They are very much motivated. They have aspiration. They can find their ways. So we just need to provide opportunities for young people. For example, many universities now provide entrepreneurship education. With that, they can create jobs by themselves. JICA, for example, provide internship program in Japan. We want to connect, young people directly with the companies, and they may be able to find their ways to create more jobs. So after hearing many presentations today, maybe we could provide young people more opportunities to bet on young people's aspiration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's some kind of believe in young people is, I think, it's a very good thing that. Thank you very much for and congratulations for the Kaizen's progress. So last speaker, private sector. Thank you for coming. He's Katsuhiro Miyake, the Executive Director of Overseas Construction Association of Japan. We call it OKAJI. Thank you. Maybe you feel a lot of pressure hearing a lot of expectation on the private sector's role. So, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah-san. Yeah, actually today, my boss, Mr. Kawata, was supposed to speak today, but due to very urgent business that happened half an hour ago, he had to leave. So I'm trying to speak on his behalf. So that's why I'm not wearing tie for today. Sorry. Okay, anyway, so I'm from the Overseas Construction Association of Japan. Our association is the organization of construction companies that carry out construction activities overseas. Our association's members are very active all over the world, and the Africa is geographically far from Japan. So currently, it doesn't account for a large proportion of our overall sales. However, we've been continuously carrying out construction work in many African countries under JICA's, thank you for JICA, so loan and grant aid programs. And Africa will become an increasingly promising market due to its potential and demographic bonus. Okay, next, I would like to talk about quality infrastructure investment. The G20 principles for quality infrastructure investment are based on the principle that quality infrastructure investment should promote openness, transparency, economic efficiency, and debt sustainability. It also requires that the investment should benefit many stakeholders, including local residents and workers, and contribute to the development of national and regional economies, while also fully meeting social demands such as disaster resilience, environmental consideration, anti-corruption, and sound debt management. Early this year, our association conducted a case study of construction work carried out by member companies in recent years in Africa. The study looked at 26 projects, focusing on how they contributed to the various aspects of the G20 principles. The results were surprising, as it turned out that infrastructure construction in line with the G20 principles was practiced in many of the projects. Today, I'd like to introduce some points common to many of the construction works. Okay, the first aspect is technology and transfer and human resources development. Japanese construction companies are keen to teach their technology to their local partner companies, their engineers and skilled workers, and are working energetically with local community to ensure high quality construction. Japanese construction companies often bring in skilled workers from Japan, such as carpenters, to teach skills to their local partners. They not only transfer technology during construction, but also teach know-how for maintenance and management on site. Many local human resources who have acquired such high-level Japanese-style construction techniques and skills go on to take on leadership positions at the other site, or are active at Japanese companies' construction sites in other countries. The second aspect is a positive impact on employment and the local economy. Japanese companies consider maintenance and maintenance activities that need to be done by locals. If there are materials and equipment that meets the required standard and can be procured in the country where the work is carried out, they will procure them locally as much as possible. In addition, general laborers are also hired as much as possible from the local area, and they will work while receiving training. For example, in the construction project for the Cocody University Hospital in Côte d'Ivoire, air conditioning equipment and exterior wall materials were procured locally, and construction was carried out by hiring about 400 workers every day. In this way, Japanese construction companies are also making a significant contribution to the virtuous cycle of the local economy. The third aspect is safety management. And not only do we manage the safety of workers on site during construction, but we also keep an eye on safety of residents and students commuting to school in the vicinity of the construction area. We implement Japanese standard safety management on site, including morning assemblies, radio exercises, and to safety patrols. The fact that there are many cases where long-term construction has been completed without any fatal accident, this can be said to be one of the contributions made by Japanese companies to the creation of high-quality infrastructure. This way, we believe that high-quality infrastructure provided by Japanese construction companies is highly valued, used, and enjoyed by many people all over the world. Thank you very much.
Very much, and we have already touched upon many collaboration issues with different stakeholders and local. And as a second round of the discussion, we'd like to move on to the question of how do we collaborate? It's an easy question and easy to be said, but it's very difficult to implement on the ground. So from the ambassador, from your experience, how do you collaborate with different stakeholders?
Yes, thank you. As we have time constraints, I will focus on the action. Yeah, I will focus on the action necessary to enhance collaboration amongst stakeholders to achieve sustainable development in Côte d'Ivoire. So it's necessary to have effective implementation of signed agreements, like agreement on investment, promotion and protection, and MOU on the financing of environmental protection projects, etc. Signing of new sectoral agreements, identifying and financing renewable energy projects, including regulated energy sources and dam upgrades, training people responsible for forest management, waste recycling, and disaster risk reduction, creating a favorable environment for companies specializing in adaptation to climate change through public-private dialogue and the dissemination of best practice. So Côte d'Ivoire is looking forward to working with all partners, and particularly with Japan, to provide technical assistance through JICA and to finance environmental preservation projects through GBIC, which has signed a memorandum of understanding with Ivorian government in 2022 in the margin of TICAD 8. I thank you.
Yes, Thomas, sorry, UNDP online. Could you please explain your experience of the collaboration with different stakeholders?
Yes, thank you
Yes.
very much, moderator. As colleagues know, UNDP stands for UNDP, United Nations Development Program. But over the last years, we have started understanding and actually emphasizing moving from programming to partnerships. As you know, colleagues, UNDP is a field-based organization. And that's where we believe that collaboration is very important. So partnership is at the heart of what we do. We work with all types of stakeholders, including governments, UN entities, international financial institutions, the private sector, foundations, CSOs, academia, even influencers. We build an influencers network in Africa. I can give you practical examples here in Pretoria. With our focus on private sector development and engagement, over the last years, we developed a tool which is called the ecosystem development approach, which allows for collective action that is demand-driven, it is locally on, enables coherent and mutually reinforcing action, allows to integrate solutions, and very important, is sustainable. This ecosystem development approach, also known as the collective action platforms at the field level, includes action platforms and also innovation channels. In Senegal, for example, we develop a pilot initiative off-grid energy solution in rural areas. So the action platform was used to create consensus and for the government to create tax incentive and feed-in tariffs for solar energy. And also in Senegal, this allowed companies to create more robust business and attract investors. The innovation challenge directly supported private sector companies to train vendors, to include to train technicians, to test selling systems and use new appliance methodologies. So at the end, this ecosystem development approach enables stakeholders to identify a shared opportunity and collaborate. We have done the same in Lesotho, but for financial inclusion with banks and telephone companies. In Uganda, we develop a solution for collaboration between companies, tourism companies, local communities, for them to develop business. Most recently in Japan, we were part of a program called Meet the Toshikas. And this program also use this methodology of ecosystem development approach. We develop in this connection, I would like to invite you to see the flyers. We have some dedicated reports on how the ecosystem works for investment in startups in Angola, in South Africa, and Zambia. And it shows how the private sector, how the venture capitalists, how the incubators and accelerators work together. Those are some practical examples that we have how to take collaboration to the next level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Osamu Kawanishi, how do you collaborate with different stakeholders?
Thank you very much. Yes, collaboration among the stakeholders is a very key issue, especially in African investment. And I'd like to make a brief two comments. Firstly, Yes, the first point is that importance of the access to local knowledge and local networks. So, for example, African Development Bank has more than 30 regional offices. And in terms of the background, African Development Bank has a unique background of the being established by African government in 1964. So African Development Bank is willing and actually plays a very instrumental role of connecting the private sector, including, of course, the foreign private sector people with local networks and local knowledge. And secondly, the importance of the sort of platform marketplace where people can, the different stakeholders can connect each other. So, for example, African Development Bank organized an annual event, Africa Investment Forum. This year, we are going to organize it in Rabat, Morocco in December, 4th and 6th. And this is intended to connect investors, project sponsors, and government representatives and the various stakeholders to promote and facilitate investment across various sectors and communicate and aiming at helping to advance projects to bankable process or raising capital and accelerating a finance closure. So I think that these 2 points could be a very important point. Thank you very much.
Very much. So Ueno-san, could you please elaborate on your stakeholders collaboration?
Yes, so JICA, of course, works with many partners, and I would say the key of the collaboration is the ownership. Ownership of the government, ownership of the people. To respect ownership, we have to be humble. We have to have a good dialogue, a good communication. I agree that we should have, local offices help us to communicate better with the government. But ownership is, I think, the key. And to respect another theme of today, I'd like to touch upon one approach to respect the ownership, especially in the field of city. In Côte d'Ivoire, JICA conducted a master plan in the capital of Abidjan and provided a master plan, long-term vision, how the city could develop itself, looking at 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. We provided to the government of Côte d'Ivoire. And with that plan, our government now collaborate with other partners such as JICA, AFD, World Bank, AFDB, which infrastructure project is necessary, which one has priority, so that the government can lead the discussion for the better of the city. So one approach that we do in a way to respect the ownership is this long-term study. We call it master plan, especially in the field of city development. Thank you.
Very much. I totally agree. Thank you. That the master plan is a very good nexus for accommodate collaboration with stakeholders. Thank you. So, Miyake-san, please.
So we are construction companies, and we are basically contractors for construction works. So the types of stakeholders involved is generally limited, but surely so it includes not only partner companies and employees and clients, but local residents and the various kind of people such as school students. There are many cases where local school students are visiting the site, a construction site, and road safety education, for example, is provided at the site. For example, in the Mombasa Port construction project in Kenya, regular road safety education is provided to residents in the surrounding area, and support is provided to locally hired workers to obtain official skill qualifications in cooperation with the Kenyan Qualification Certification Agency. To foster good collaboration with local stakeholders and contribute to skills development in the future, we hope it would be helpful for international organizations such as OECD and the World Bank to recognize and promote such benefits of working with Japanese construction companies. Actually, we have just finished compiling survey results of the 26 construction projects in Africa in 3 languages, say in Japanese, in English, and French. If you are interested in this publication, please feel free to contact us at our association's website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you. As a moderator, I just want to conclude the session by 5 areas, but I will be definitely in 30 seconds. First, we talk a lot about the importance of younger people. Younger people-centric approach is necessary. Think about the younger people, what they are the most best well-trained, what kind of ways they are really waiting for. And giving them opportunity is a good way to think about what kind of training is important. Second is to think about the local. Maybe we need a lot of transport for technology. Transport is necessary, but so that will be the purpose of the technology transfer is so that local people can do it by themselves. And that is very apparent in the case of the construction companies examples. Third element is, the private sector is very important for the investment, knowledge, technologies, and finance, and maybe the very diverse format of how to finance jobs and skills development is going to be very important. And lastly, about the collaboration, the holistic approach and partnership approach, and ecosystem development approach and ownership approach. We heard many interesting ways how to enhance collaboration. So, but lastly, I want to also highlight the importance of the governments, because the governments are leading for the investment, of course, and like a master plan, which is developed usually by the government. And those government supports cannot be done without the private sectors and international organizations, international finance organizations, and then maybe the OECD. So I really like to thank you, and please join me for big hands for the great speakers and great speakers online too. Thank you very much.